All right, so we left off on feathers last time and the diversity of all the different feathers that make up a bird. And so we'll get into talking about molt. This is a question a lot of people are usually interested in about birds and their feathers. So molting is just simply when the bird is replacing the feathers with new ones. So the feather grows in the certain feather tract and pushes out the old. So in with the new, out with the old, and birds have to molt their feathers because they rely on their feathers for everything from waterproofing to advertising to different sex and same sex and to, of course, flight. So they need to keep their feathers in tip-top shape, and just like everything else, it wears away with age and sun wear and weather. So it's important for a bird to refresh its feathers and do at least one complete molt each year. So complete molt is shedding, changing out all of its feathers, including body feathers, flight feathers, everything. And they'll usually do this after they finish breeding and before they migrate generally, because it's pretty energetically expensive. So you don't want to be doing it while you're investing all your energy in breeding or migrating. So, and then there's some birds that you'll see at your feeders now that like the American goldfinch. Now it's looking like this on the left, whereas in the summer it looked like the picture on the right. So this is just a partial molt. And they'll do this to get into their nuptial plumage, it's called. So they'll just do their body feathers. So this bird on the left, come spring, will undergo a partial molt, just its body feathers, to get into its alternate, what's called its alternate plumage, or its breeding plumage. There's only 2 North American bird species that undergo 2 complete molts per year, because that's a lot of energy to shed everything twice each year. But these are the Franklin's gull and the bobolink. So one is a seabird and the other is a grassland bird. And both of these birds are in pretty harsh environments. The bobolink is exposed to a lot of sun. It's out in the open all the time. Franklin's gull is in a sea environment, also out in the sun a lot. And so their evolution has landed on 2 molts, complete molts per year. So this is a picture of, you can see the feather sheaths. When we talk about molt, these are the feathers coming in. You see evidence of it is sometimes more obvious than others. This is a gray catbird molting its flight feathers, which are these long feathers that you see here. And then also molting its coverts, which are the small protective coverings over top of the flight feathers. You can see those new fresh feathers coming in. So this is sort of the wing morphology that an ornithologist uses. We really pay attention to the primaries. So, and they're labeled P1 all the way to P10. And then we have the inner flight feathers, are the secondaries, and they're labeled S1 to S10. And they're labeled in the order in which they molt. A typical molt will start at P1 and then move to the outers, and then it'll start at the secondaries S1, move to the inners. So we keep track of it with the numbers there. And so hatchier birds, remember we said molting is pretty energetically expensive. So we call them a hatchier bird. It's a bird that was just hatched this summer. So in its first fall, it's also only going to undergo a partial molt, because you think of a baby bird, or I guess teenage bird, just getting around in the world, figuring out how to fly itself and get its own food. It doesn't really have the resources to also molt its entire plumage. And so you'll see, so the partial molt will include its body feathers. And here we're looking at the wing, the wing of a rose-breasted grosbeak, a young rose-breasted grosbeak. So it molted all of these coverts, which are called the greater coverts. And then it left all of these. These are retained juvenile feathers. And you can really see on a bird like this the difference. If you had it in the hand or even if you saw it sitting on a branch, some ornithologists or birders can see this, what we call molt limit. So that's where the molt stopped, and then you have the retained. So you have this bird in the hand and you see those different feather ages, and you can tell that it was hatched this year. And then this is sort of the calendar that an ornithologist uses. Every bird just has a birthday on January 1st. That's how we do it. So this is a cute little chart somebody made at some point for the bird banding lab. So you start here, baby bird in the nest, it fledges, means it leaves the nest. He's wearing all red, which is, we'll say Kmart, cheap Kmart clothing. I don't know if anybody shops at Kmart anymore, if this metaphor even works anymore, but this is how, so they've got the cheap Kmart clothing in June, July. Now that little baby bird bopping around on its own is going to go through just a partial molt. So the green is what he just molted. So he just molted into his more expensive Gap clothing. But he didn't do all of it because, like I said, it's too energetically expensive for a young bird. He's preparing for his first migration. So he's going to have this Kmart Gap combo. And then he's going to migrate in the fall. And then January 1st is his birthday. So he has his birthday on his wintering grounds. And then he migrates back to his summer breeding grounds. Now, so he passed that birthday of January 1st, and now we call him a second-year bird, even though he's not technically 2 years old, if that makes sense. So if we see this bird now in the spring, and we see this guy in his Kmart Gap combo, we know, hey, you were hatched last summer. You're a young bird, relatively. So then he goes through breeding. He finds a female that accepts that he's in Kmart Gap combo clothing, X-rated. And then he's got his new, then once he's done breeding, all that, now he has the energy to do his very first full complete molt. So now he's got all new Gap clothes that fall, the end of that summer, that fall. So now we can call him an after second year bird. So that gets a little confusing and takes banders a long time to learn, but just to give you a little taste of the complexities of bird aging. But some birders actually will try and keep an eye out for things like this in the field. So if you saw this as a blue-gray gnatcatcher, and if you had really good binoculars, you could zoom in on him on a branch and see all of these covert feathers. You see how brown they are compared to the rest of him that's this beautiful pearly slate gray. So these are retained juvenile feathers. If I saw him in the spring, I would know that bird was hatched last summer. Or if I saw him in the fall, I'd say he was hatched that summer, the young bird. And there's other ways to tell a young bird besides just the plumage. Sometimes you can go by eye color. So this is, these are gray catbirds. The one on the left is an adult gray catbird with a deep black dark eye. And then on the right is a juvenile, a hatchier gray catbird, and its eye is a little muddy and gray, if you can see that. And then this is a really young catbird. He maybe left the nest a few weeks ago, and he has what we call bird lips. Do you see this fleshy part there at the end of its bill that is hardened here on the adult on the left? So that's just a baby characteristic for gaping when they're in the nest, opening their mouths wide to be fed. So these are just some other pictures of wings. This is a Baltimore Oriole. This is an adult, what do you call, after second year bird. Everything's nice and uniform and black. Here's an Indigo Bunting. You can really see that what we call molt limit on this. All of these have this like indigo blue edging, and then you've got these retained juvenile brown coverts that don't have any edging, and then you can see on this older bird how they all have that beautiful blue edging. Sometimes tails can tell a lot. So this guy molted half of its tail is new and fresh, and then the right side is kind of older and duller. Sometimes we can tell, so this is a bird that was hatched this year because the only time the whole tail So we can tell this tail grew in all at the same time, all the tail feathers grew in at once in the nest. Because you can see little growth bars as it's growing, the feathers are growing day and night. And then this line, this drastic line across is actually what we call a fault bar. You don't always see that, but that's an indicator of poor nutrition in the nest. So kind of like the rings of a tree, you can see the rings in a bird's feather can tell you a lot about what happened in the nest. So that could have been a storm where the parents, or a hurricane or something, or a multi-day rain event where the parents could not get the bird enough food to eat. So it resulted in this fault line, this dark line on the tail. So just some interesting intricacies of bird feathers. So avian life cycle, the other thing that makes a bird is, of course, their incredible different nests. All the different species have built a different kind of nest, and some of them are really incredible. This is a chimney swift. This is an aerial insectivore that nests inside of a hollow tree, or if you provide a chimney-like cavity, like this picture was taken in. And the adults build this nest. It's like a cantilevered platform of sticks, little depression of sticks. And just with its bill and its feet, it breaks off these tiny little twigs from trees and just glues it together with its saliva. That's it. It's sticks and saliva gluing, and it's rock hard, the structure, and it holds the chicks 20 some days until they fledge. So really incredible. It takes the adult about 2 weeks to make that structure. So passerines are the largest order of birds, and they include the songbirds. Not all passerines are not songbirds, but all songbirds are passerines. These are the perching birds. So they're all altricial, which is the ornithological term meaning that they're born blind, naked, and helpless. So this is a picture of an eastern bluebird chick. You can see he's essentially totally naked, eyes closed, except for some little fluff, some little down to help keep him warm on his head and his back. So the passerines have pretty small eggs. They're poorly provisioned, so that when they hatch, they're sort of like, they look like little fetuses. And so it takes about 2 weeks from hatching until they can leave the nest. And it's the most dangerous time in a bird's life, that time in the nest, because you're vulnerable to a host of predators, including other birds like grackles and jays, including mice, raccoons, snakes, cats, anything, even skunks. So tons of predators, very dangerous time. So you are pressed to get out of the nest as soon as you possibly can. So there's all different ways to do this, and many wide array in the different species. So that we have the eastern bluebird we may all be familiar with. This is a cavity nesting bird because it's a cavity nesting bird. So these would traditionally use holes in a decaying tree, or a hole that was made by a woodpecker, or they'll use a bird box that simulates a natural cavity. And because they're a little safer in their cavity, they kind of take their time developmentally. So it takes about 18 days for a bluebird to fledge. And then it's not until like day 20 that the bluebird can actually fly. And then it's a couple weeks after that, or to 3 weeks even, that the parents are still helping to feed these young that have fledged. So it takes a long time to grow a baby bird. And this is just a really amazing little nest cam of a bluebird box, of a bluebird family. You can see she's actually eating the eggshells now. Dad. I'll stop that. I could just watch that all day. I think that's so amazing. But we shall move on if I can get to the next slide here. Never likes to do that after oops, there we go. So bluebird takes about 18 days to fledge. That's a cavity nesting bird. For comparison, this is a Carolina wren, only takes 11 days to fledge. And one of the reasons for such a shorter hatch to fledge time is because this is an open cup nester. So it's more exposed to predators. And so it's more pertinent to get those babies out of the nest a little faster. So these are some pictures of some Carolina wren nests. That one was in the weed whacker at Rushton Farm. They'll nest in pretty close to the house, your house, in planters or other strange locations. So their eggs are a little bigger relative to their body size. So they're a little less altricial when they hatch, and they can fledge a little faster than the eastern bluebirds. Among the shortest rate of development of any of the altricial species of bird is the very cool yellow-billed cuckoo. It's a bird, eastern forest bird, also known as the rain crow, because they often are heard singing in the forest on summer days before thunderstorms. They have the shortest rate of development because they have the largest egg size relative to the female body size. So for comparison, this is a nest of the tiny ones are yellow warbler eggs, so tiny bird. And then the yellow-billed cuckoo is the big giant one. You can see how much bigger it is. So it's more highly provisioned. And so that when the baby hatches, it's got a leg up. Day 2, the baby cuckoo is snapping, is like perched on the edge of the nest and snapping at flies. And by day 7, the chick is out of the nest. So it's absolutely blinding fast development that ornithologists have been studying. One of the reasons is because this is a bird that feeds on irregularly available food items like tent caterpillars and some poisonous caterpillars. So because their food species is eruptive, they need to be able to move with that and breed on the fly. So really incredible. And then our familiar northern cardinal has the longest post-fledging parental care of any songbird. So up to almost 3 months, 2.5 months maybe. So this is a bird that nests from March all the way till September. It'll just keep trying, because 15 to 37% of cardinal nests, only 15 to 37% succeed in fledging young. So they're just really susceptible to predators. They just throw together some sticks in like a low area. So those babies really need to hurry up and get out of the nest. So they pop out of the nest around day 9, and they can't even fly until day 20. So you can see why they require so much parental care after they leave the nest. But like I said, the most dangerous time is that nest. So you need to get out as soon as you possibly can. It's safer to get out even before you can fly than to sit in there and wait to develop your flight feathers. There's other cool things like what's called Batesian mimicry in hummingbirds. So the ruby-throated hummingbird, we all know that's a teensy tiny little bird. So she's restricted by her aerial demands. She's always flying around, tiny body size. So her eggs are teeny tiny. They're like only a little bigger than like Tic Tacs, it seems. So, and then because they're so poorly provisioned, it takes about 21 days from hatching to fledging for the ruby-throated hummingbirds. And again, they're highly susceptible to predators. So what they think is that for about a week, the really helpless babies have this yellow down that actually mimics the fur on a black flannel moth caterpillar, which is a poisonous North American caterpillar. So it's imitating, and maybe imitating something that's poisonous to help protect it from predators that may have encountered this caterpillar and know to stay away from it. So Batesian mimicry, it's sort of same as viceroy butterfly imitating the monarch butterfly, because the monarch is poisonous. So you get some safety when you do that. So then we have altricial birds that are born helpless, and then precocial birds. These are like our game birds, geese, grouse, ducks. These all hit the ground running. They've got much larger, better provisioned eggs. And so when they hatch, these young can often fly or walk right away. So those are precocial birds, don't require so much parental care. And then we have other methods like the brown-headed cowbird. This is not a very liked bird because it's kind of a cheater. So it's a brood parasite. It will lay its egg in, this is the male brown-headed cowbird. The female is just all brown, and she'll lay her egg in any other bird's nest that she can find. So this is the picture of, this is a chipping sparrow nest. You can see the tiny little chipping sparrow eggs, and then the bigger speckled brown-headed cowbird egg. And she just dumps it there and then leaves it, and the chipping sparrow will have to care for its young and the brown-headed cowbird young. And often what happens is the brown-headed cowbird young outcompetes the other species and kicks them out of the nest, and they don't make it. And the chipping sparrow will just be taking care of the brown-headed cowbird. So not pleasant to watch, but the brown-headed cowbirds are increasing in numbers in the east. They used to be restricted to the grasslands of Middle America, but they've been able to spread east with human development and loss of forests, destruction of forests. So they do really well in fragmented areas, which is kind of what we have now. So our birds, forest birds like wood thrush, are suffering a little bit from these brown-headed cowbirds, because wood thrush is remember that's the bird we talked about that can duet with itself. It's an interior forest nesting bird, but often they're forced to nest in fragmented forests because there's not a lot of interior forest habitat left. And when they nest on fragmented forests near edges, then they're susceptible to brown-headed cowbird nest parasitism. And then we just have some other most wanted birds here. So these are are our two main invasive birds. These are non-native birds. A cowbird actually technically is native and protected under the North American Bird Treaty Act, but these guys are not. Whoops. These are both introduced to America in late 1800s because people wanted to pay homage to William Shakespeare and have all the birds that he mentioned over here in North America, New York City. And they're actually really aggressive and took over, and now they're some of the most numerous birds, and they are very competitive with some of our cavity nesting birds like the bluebird. So the eastern bluebird was pretty rare in the early 1900s because of habitat loss, and then also because of competition with these non-native cavity nesters like the house sparrow and the European starling. So it wasn't until the 60s and 70s when concerns started growing over the decline of bluebirds, and people started building and monitoring bluebird trails, bluebird boxes, and monitoring them is so important so that you're not providing a nesting trail for house sparrows. So monitoring and providing the boxes is so important. And it's why you can see bluebirds so numerously today in Pennsylvania, thanks to the bird boxes. And then a little bit about mating systems. If you took an actual ornithology class, you could spend a long time on this because it gets pretty complicated with birds. It's interesting. Even in the 1960s, most people thought that, and a lot of scientists thought that birds were largely monogamous, and now they realize that that's really the exception rather than the rule. Most birds are very promiscuous, and there's a lot of complicated things going on. One exception is the Laysan albatross, and this is a seabird. So this is Wisdom. She's the oldest bird in the world. Oldest known bird in the world. She just turned 70 on Midway National Wildlife Refuge in the North Pacific. She was banded in 1956. She's had something like 37 chicks, and she's been with her mate since 2010, and she met him at a dance party. So there are some examples of love in the bird world. But it's really incredible that this bird has lived that long because this is a species that is affected by things like climate change. So climate change has been changing things like currents. So they may need ocean currents, they may need to fly further to find food for their young. They forage out in the open ocean. And then they're also susceptible to unsustainable fishing practices like longline fishing. So it's really amazing that she has reached the ripe old age of 70. Incredible bird.
Excuse me, is that bird in captivity? How do they know it's? How do they know it's 70? How do they know it's 70 years old?
Good question. She was banded in 1956, so people watch her. Yeah, so she's able to interact, and she's in a national wildlife refuge, so ornithologists follow her pretty closely. Yeah, good question. So ornithologists really pay attention to now the full annual life cycle of birds. They used to really focus on the breeding grounds. Now they know that not only the breeding grounds are important, but the wintering grounds are important, and then all these habitats that they use in between. So birds, in order to conserve a species, you need to know how many there are, where they are, and what they need to survive. And turns out birds need a lot of varied habitats in different stages of their life. So after they leave the nest, they may seek specific habitat before their first fall migration. So that's post-fledging habitat. They spend about a third of their lives in migration, and a lot of that time during migration is spent on stopover habitat. So very important, all these different habitats, and the connectivity is important in the life cycle of a bird and conserving a species. So they're studying migratory connectivity a little more with things like geolocators and nanotags, and starting to learn a lot more information about birds. So like this area in Colombia is actually really important as a staging area for a lot of our migrants. So they tagged a couple years ago a gray-cheeked thrush that set off from Colombia and was picked up 3 days later in Indiana on its northbound migration. It had flown 2,000 miles in about 3 days, nonstop flight. So great quote from Scott Weidensaul: bird migration is the world's only true unifying natural phenomenon, stitching the continents together in a way that even the great weather systems fail to do. If you want to learn more about migration, I would definitely suggest some of Scott Weidensaul's books. There's one, World on the Wing, Global Odyssey of Migration. That's his newest. We'll briefly touch on it here. So Neotropical Migrants. These are birds that essentially were tropical birds, and then the ice sheets receded and North America opened up to them. And so they now are birds of two worlds, and they migrate up to the temperate zones for the summer. Some theories are that there's less predators there. It's kind of a safer, lower density breeding area. And then the main theory coming up on the next slide is the food availability. So lots of food in North America in the summer for feeding your young. So these birds, like this black-throated blue warbler pictured on the right, a warbler, a bird that weighs 1/3 of an ounce, can easily travel a couple hundred miles in a night. And 80% of our birds actually do migrate by night. And they do that because the atmosphere is a little bit more still. So as these small songbirds have to pump continuously, whereas a raptor can soar. But if you're pumping your wings continuously, you can easily overheat if you're flying in the sunlight. So that's one reason why they may migrate by night. Also maybe less predators. Many of the songbirds use star cues. They know to keep the Big Dipper at their backs as they head south. So they're using celestial cues. And then also migrating by night allows them to be able to stop over in habitats during the day and forage and refuel. So in a couple classes, Lauren will tell you all about aquatic macroinvertebrates, but this is sort of the North American protein pulse that the birds are coming for. We've got glacial soils that feed our waterways, and the freeze-thaw cycles lead to this emergence of insects, aquatic insects, and other juicy insects like caterpillars in the spring and the summer that fuel bird breeding. So a little bit about avian aerodynamics in some amazing migration stories. So the bar-tailed godwit is the longest avian nonstop flight. This bird breeds in Alaska and flies 7,500 miles nonstop to New Zealand. It was tagged with a geolocator, I believe, traveling that flight nonstop. So they fuel up for 2 months in Alaska, eating clams and worms, doubling their body weight to make this flight in about 11 days, 55 miles per hour, about 11 days nonstop. Pretty incredible. And then we've got little tiny birds like the American redstart who could never do such a feat because they just don't have the fuel reserve. So a bar-tailed godwit doubles its weight to be able to do that. An American redstart wouldn't be able to fly if it did that. So stopover habitat is even more important sometimes, arguably for small warblers like the American redstart spends a lot more time in stopover habitat refueling. Other avian athletes, the semi-palmated sandpiper is a bird that breeds in the subarctic tundra and flies nonstop partially over the ocean to South America, 2,500 miles. And this is the equivalent of a human running over 100 marathons without resting, eating, drinking. Crazy. Some of the things that allow them to do this is they have what's called unihemispheric sleep they recently discovered. So the left side of this bird is the slow wave sleeping, and the right side is awake. So all animals have to sleep. So if you can do that by just doing one part of the brain at a time, then you can stay active and continue your migration. Fuel loading, we mentioned they need to pack on the fat. This is when you birds, if you blow in the wishbone area, you can see subcutaneous fat. So the bird on the left has no fat, just an empty cavity, and then the bird on the right is bulging with this orange. So he's ready to make probably a long overnight flight. And this is a picture of the bar-tailed godwit, the longest avian nonstop flight. So they double they put on, they're like bodybuilders. They put on double the size of their flight muscles, the pectoral muscles in the breast. And they're doubling that, they're doubling their fat. And so they've got to shrink other things that they don't need. So they shrink things like the stomach and the gizzard to be able to accomplish this incredible feat. So birds are amazing. We've gone through that, but why are they important?
Question.
They have a lot of, what's that?
The geolocators, are they based on GPS? How do they work? The geolocators that are attached to these birds.
Yeah, the geolocators are we've advanced since then. Now there's other radio transmitters and nanotags. The geolocators just go by the latitude and longitude based on the sun. So it's logging the day length and can pinpoint. Well, it can't pinpoint exact locations, so our radio transmitters are a little better.
Does it transmit back all the time, or just when the bird lands, or what?
The geolocators you have to recapture, whereas the radio transmitters, some of those use cell towers, or we'll talk a little later about MODIS, which is really the cutting edge technology that there's radio receiving towers that they fly by, and that'll pick up their signal.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So birds function, they have a lot of different functions in the ecosystem. Seed dispersal, so corvids are like the jays and the crows. They can regenerate oak and pine forests by caching more than they can eat, more seeds than they can eat. So cache is the biological term for storing, C-A-C-H-E. So they store, a blue jay can actually carry 5 acorns at a time and then store all of those in different areas. So a lot of plants have evolved with relying on birds as their dispersal mechanism. And then of course we have pollinators like the hummingbirds, very important in plant pollination. And then our tropical crops, we've got tropical birds down there spreading those seeds and pollinating flowers. So insect and pest control, also a big role that birds play in the ecosystem. So little insect eating birds like the warbler that you see here on the left. If we didn't have those, our forest would be burdened with more leaf boring insects and insects that could defoliate the trees and potentially lead to more climate change effects. And then we've got the rodent pest control as well. So they estimate one barn owl, that's the bird on the right here, can kill 11,000 mice in its lifetime, which represents an estimated 13 tons of crops that those mice could have eaten. So they keep everything in balance, birds, even carcass removal and disease mitigation. Or we've got black vultures and turkey vultures. These are black vultures, so they take care of all this removal of dead things in the environment. They estimated over in Spain that vultures saved them over €1 million in cattle carcass removal. And then other birds are keystone species. So that means it plays a role in the ecosystem that others rely on. So things like a pileated woodpecker is a keystone species, creating a cavity that other birds can't make. They don't have that wood drilling tool to be able to do it. Then there's over 40 bird species in North America that are what's called a secondary cavity nester. It means they rely on woodpecker carpentry for roosting and nesting sites. So just that's like the eastern bluebird, like these little northern saw-whet owls need those cavities. So, and then last but not least, birds are indicator species. So their presence or absence can indicate the health of a certain habitat. So this pictured here is a great example, a northern water thrush. They can only exist in healthy streams because they actually eat some of those aquatic insects. They feed on those macroinvertebrates, specifically things like mayflies that only exist in clean, non-polluted water. So ornithologists studying these birds can determine the health of water systems based on their presence or absence. And then as a whole, birds are indicator species to the health of our environment as a whole. And so that leads to the inevitable, what's happening to our birds today and our environment today. Well, birds are telling us that it may not be, it's not so good. We may need to change what we're doing here. So big study came out a few years ago now in the journal Science, saying that almost 3 billion birds have disappeared from North America in less than one human lifetime since 1970. So this represents about 1 in 4 birds gone. And this is not just, we're not talking species, we're talking individuals. So a third of individual birds. So why are they declining? There's a lot of different reasons. The biggest reason is habitat loss. And then actually the second reason they've estimated is actually cats kill an estimated 2.4 billion birds a year in the US alone. That's feral and domestic. And then another big one is, of course, pesticides, chemicals, and then collisions of, this is actually an older infographic. Collisions are actually even greater. They estimate that at 1 billion birds may die each year from collision with buildings, and half of that is from just residential homes, birds hitting your window at home. And we'll talk more about ways to mitigate some of that stuff in the future. Just wanted to give you an overview of some of the problems. And then of course, not listed there was climate change is another problem facing birds today. So migratory birds, 2.5 billion migratory birds lost since 1970. Even common birds like the Baltimore Oriole, I say 2 in 5 lost since 1970. So this means even the loss of just these common birds, like blue jays and orioles, shows that our ecosystems are sort of losing their ability to support even the most basic of bird life. Grassland birds, any birds that are specialists like this, are really going to be heavy hit. So over 50% of grassland birds have declined. That's 3 in 4 eastern meadowlarks gone since 1970. Aerial insectivores are hit heavy because, well, one theory is climate change, because these birds often will migrate down, to South America. When they're migrating back north, they don't know what the temperature is. They just go by what their evolution says, which is that it's time to go back north to breed. Well, with our crazy weather fluctuations, if it's a cold spring, they may not, because they have to eat insects on the wing. They may die if they get back too soon and there's snow or it's cold and they can't find food. And then the other thing that may be impacting aerial insectivores is our widespread use of pesticides, of course, insecticides. So there's a lot of different solutions that we'll kind of start talking about in the next class. But what I want to start with here is just sort of what we at the Trust are doing to help birds. And I'd start with, this is Rushton Farm, is where our bird banding station is. And then I'll talk a little more about what bird banding is as a tool for studying populations. But this is just the setting. Rushton Farm is a 6-acre farm. It's It's a special farm. It's regenerative. It's modeling regenerative agriculture, which some argue is the way of the future, because world population has doubled in the past 50 years. We're at 7.6 billion, heading towards 9 billion by 2050, and we're running out of arable land. And regenerative agriculture seeks to produce food for people while also maintaining wildlife habitat. And regenerative agriculture is, you may be unfamiliar term to you. We've all heard sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture, but this is actually going beyond both of those, because you're seeking to reinvigorate these ecosystems and reinvigorate the soil. So you're actually giving back to the environment rather than just sustaining it. So by taking care of the soils, no tilling, no chemicals, using cover crops, keeping all of this erosion control habitat, forests, shrublands all around the farm. This is farming of old. This is how our founding farmers like Thomas Jefferson did it. And incidentally, this farm only uses as much water as a 3-bedroom house because it uses a special drip irrigation system that was developed in Israel. So for comparison, conventional agriculture, the dominant agriculture today, uses heavy machinery, uses tilling, which degrades the soil first and foremost. You start with tilling, then you're going to have to start using all these chemical inputs because you've degraded the soil. And incidentally, the chemicals that we started using in our agricultural system in the 70s came about from World War II and chemical warfare. And we decided, hey, wouldn't it be great to start using that on our crops? So it's really crazy when you think about it. And so it's, it's bad for the health, it's bad for the soil. They've studied that these neonicotinoids, it's an insecticide you may have heard of with honeybee collapse disorder. They studied the effect on birds, and a white-crowned sparrow. These white-crowned sparrows during migration were nanotagged. We'll talk about that later, but this is the radio transmitting tag. They discovered that when they were exposed to these neonicotinoids, ate a seed that was coated in it, they actually got anorexic. And it took them about 3 extra days to be able to continue their migration, which has population level effects on these birds, because if they can't get back to the spring breeding grounds in time, they may not be able to reproduce. Or the other way around, if they can't get south fast enough, they may not be getting enough food and be compromised that way. So big problems. Soil, one handful of soil is supposed to contain as many more microorganisms than people that ever lived. It's supposed to be alive. And a handful of soil in a conventional agricultural setting is devoid of microorganisms. We've lost about 1/3 of the topsoil in the past 50 years since the 70s. I think they say it takes 100 years to make an inch of topsoil. So at the rate that we're going with erosion, so with the tilling and the chemicals, it creates, our erosion rates are higher than they've ever been. And so if we keep going at the rate that we are, we'll lose all the topsoil in, I think they say, like 60 years. So we've got 40 million people getting displaced off their land because of desertification, which is the soil degradation from intensive agriculture causes the soil to release carbon dioxide and water, resulting in desertification. And then people need to seek more of this in-demand cropland to feed our growing population. And guess what? That's at the expense of our forests, where birds live. So 60% of world deforestation is because of this sort of cropland grab, land grab. And so that results in a direct loss of habitat to birds, and then also increase in climate change effects that is at a detriment to birds. So healthy soil, cornerstone of life. If we can gain back control over our food systems, we could actually result in, we could actually promote drawdown of CO2, atmospheric CO2, which is really what some scientists say we need, because to stop climate change, now there's sort of this legacy load of CO2. So you don't need to just reduce your CO2 emissions, you need something that actually draws it down. And so soil actually can do that, because soil can sequester more CO2 than the atmosphere and the plants living on it combined. So some say that regenerative agriculture can actually reverse global warming. So it's a way of changing the way we do things, kind of going back to old. So that's what we do here at Rushton Farm: regenerative agriculture, soil, increasing water, increasing biodiversity, ecosystem health, and of course, bird habitat. And getting into a little more our farmers. So here's a picture of a bumblebee and then a non-native European honeybee. We've got honeybees and delicious honey, but our farmers make sure that they don't outcompete the native bees, because the native bees and flies and moths and butterflies, those native pollinators are actually doing more work. They're doing about 2/3 of the pollination, and the honeybees only do about 1/3. So it's really important to have wildflower strips, to have strips of native plants bordering your croplands, because it really increases your crop yields, and it increases, of course, bird habitat, and increases all of these insect pests that can actually help you, beneficial insects that can help you with agricultural pests. Like, for example, on the lower right is a braconid wasp, and pictured here is a hornworm, a tomato hornworm, that is a known agricultural pest of the tomato crop. And right about the time when these tomato hornworms are coming out, because we have all of the native plants that support birds, insects, and this wasp, the wasp comes in and actually lays its eggs inside the body of the hornworm, and the larva like literally mummifies this hornworm and eats the insides. And then what you're seeing here is the cocoons of the wasp larva. So nature's made of millions of intricate interactions, and the more biodiversity you have, the more you invite those back in, and the less need you have for chemicals and that sort of thing. So then, also there's things like regenerative ranching kind of taking hold here. Some say one of the best things to do is to go vegetarian, but it's not necessarily, some say, cows aren't bad, it's how we raise them that's bad. So if you choose pasture-raised or grass-fed, they're on this like bird habitat. They're out in these fields roaming around. These fields will help sequester carbon dioxide, whereas when you get them from feedlots, it's doing the opposite. So we do our bird banding at Rushton Farm to show the effects of this regenerative type farming on wildlife conservation. So we banded 15,000 birds over the past 11 years of 100, we caught our 101st species this year. So that's just to show you the diversity that a farm within a nature preserve can invite. So this is just the process here. If you were to come, you'd see our net set up. It's called a mist net. The birds get caught and we gently extract them. We have a permit from the government, federal USGS permit. You can see our tools, put the little band on the birds. It has a special 9-digit number. So that bird is forever identified as a unique individual. If he gets captured again, we can learn a lot of good information about its whereabouts, its longevity. In the hand, we'll look at things like molt limits, like I showed you before, to age the bird. We'll measure the wing. We'll look at fat stores. So what we showed you before, the full fat. We like to see full fat during migration. It means that they have found enough to eat in our habitat, enough berries and insects to fatten up and refuel and continue their migratory journeys. And that's just a picture of a molt limit in a northern flicker. You can see these yellow, bright yellow shafts are the new replaced feathers, and then these duller ones are the juvenile feathers. And then the bird is released back into the wild. And then I'll just end with these adorable little northern saw-whet owls, which is what we're doing now. We also study the northern saw-whet owls that like our organic mice at the farm. And this is a little bit different of a practice. This is active banding. So the songbird banding that we just saw is passive, where we have like 16 nets set up where we know these birds will be foraging. Whereas northern saw-whet owls, you need to actively lure them in. So we surround an audio lure with our mist nets, and the audio lure is playing the tooting call of the male saw-whet owl. And so you're drawing these guys in for potentially miles. So this is a boreal species that comes south in some winters, sort of an eruptive species.